Hello, audience. I'm delighted that we are able to join you today. I'm Rakesh, and
Jimmy Hansen.
both of us are really going to explore the issues and opportunities that lie with due diligence, particularly when conducting M&A work, whether it happens to be a corporate transaction or an asset-based transaction. We've been seeing lots of issues occur over the years, lots of opportunities arising from that. But unfortunately, where the issues occur, they have really long-reaching consequences, and some people have even lost their lives as a result of that. So, we're going to have a jam session. Hopefully you enjoy it. We're going to be talking about issues and opportunities, as I said before. Let's see where this takes us. Jimmy, really good to have you on board. You've flown all the way from Sweden for this.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. These are really important topics, and especially for the asset owner out there and people who are working with M&A activities. I think it's so important, so it needs to be reflected in a session like this, where we can just look at the potential that this can bring, just to give you an opportunity to reflect on what we're talking about. I mean, what we're saying, it might not be the truth for everything, but hopefully we'll give you some insights on where to strengthen and where to improve in your normal processes.
What I'd like to start doing, if you don't mind, Jimmy, is just explaining to our audience a little bit about your background.
So I've been in the energy business now for more than 25 years, and I worked with many different technologies. I work with nuclear, that's where I have my main background. And then I work with offshore wind, onshore wind, and PV predominantly. So
one of the reasons that I asked that is because not very many people know that we've been working together for a number of years now. Actually, as a result of doing some work for you and your team, your asset management team many years ago, we were looking at some of the decision making around a project. I think we'd acquired the project, and one of the questions that I'd asked was whether key risks were identified during the due diligence exercise. And one of your team members said to me, well, we don't have to worry about that because we've had the lender's due diligence done, and that's all fine. And we did a red flag due diligence, and we did pick up some material issues, but none of them around, operational or safety risk. And I thought, that's rather interesting. So what's your view about the general landscape of due diligence and M&A and suitability of the current practice?
My view here is that most of this is actually done in a very standardized way. So when we do an M&A activity and attach the due diligence on top of that in order to secure that we cover all the different risks, financial, legal, and then the technical side of it, I'm not always sure that it also looked at your business objectives. So are they actually aligned with each other? So what are we actually looking for? What do we want to bring into our portfolio? And actually, do we have the right competences and the right scope within the people who are conducting the due diligence as well? Because I think that plays a big role here as well. So if we purely look at the technical side, as an example here, you look at if the turbines or your PV plant is built to the standard that sets out in the as-built documentation and the owner's requirement. That's great. That's a big tick in the box. But what about the potential underlying risks that sits within the asset that can have an impact, not just on people's health and safety, but also on your long-term LCOE targets and the yield from that you expect to get out there from this? That's not necessarily in alignment, is my view, actually. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And this in itself is quite interesting because we worked together with a client, a large utility, and we were trying to understand, when developing projects right from the very outset, what are the implications, both from an asset owner's perspective, if they are going to develop to own or develop to sell, and what are the issues going to be from a buyer's perspective. So how do asset strategies, whether they're D2O, develop to own or develop to sell, affect something like due diligence? What should people be focusing on?
First of all, you need to check that the intention and objectives from the developer is similar or equal to your objectives. So basically, going back to what you were just saying, if this is a developer who just want to flip the assets very quickly, develop to sell. It could be, I'm not saying it's the case, but it could be that they're not looking at the long-term outcome here. So they might want to achieve a very low capex and yes, opex of course as well, but not the entire formula when it comes to LCOE. So, and I think this has an impact. And if you then look at someone who had intention to build this for the long term and put that as the main objective here, then they will ensure that they have competence throughout the design phase as well in order to drive the right technology and the learning from the previous asset that they either built or operated in order to achieve that business objective. That might match much better with you and your business, with your objectives when you do an M&A transaction.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here, if I may, and I'm an investor in a renewable business, or I am the commercial director or the chief financial officer. And for me, what ultimately is important are the returns. So therefore, if I'm developing to sell, economics dictates that I should put the least effort and investment as possible in the development process and extract as much value as I possibly can from that for a sale. Yeah. So what's wrong with that from an economics?
I think what you're saying there is correct, and I see that, and I've seen that in the past as well when I've been out there. But that could also be a good objective from you when you're doing a transaction as well, because if you understand what you want to see and what you're looking for, actually coming back to the skills and the competence that you have in your due diligence team, then you will identify those potential risks that is there through the due diligence process. That means you have an ability to push back on price because you have to create a mitigation. You might need to add something to your assets because it's not built according to occupational health and safety rules, because it might be overseen when you did the first design. So that might be an outcome that you as an investor might see very positive, which the developer might have missed from their objective.
If I'm understanding you correctly, what I think you're saying is that buyers need to be quite introspective and highly intelligent and use the due diligence tool or tools to be able to understand what are those underlying risks by querying what is the seller's objective and matching it with theirs.
Correct, because that could also be an opportunity for someone doing the transaction. So it's not just finding a gold-plated asset that have all the features that you want to have, because then it could potentially be very expensive.
Yes.
So finding an asset like that also could bring you opportunities. But if that opportunity is missed, you might have unforeseen risk that you don't aware of. And that will be a cost in the end. The cost could be either that you need to add more capex into your asset, but it could also unfortunately mean that you have people seriously harmed on the site.
Absolutely.
And that's something we don't want to see and want to avoid.
Quite interestingly, the reason I have a smile on my face is because not so long ago, Jimmy and I were having a conversation, and Jimmy says, ask this group of people about Jimmy's golden toilet seat. Do you want to explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, I can do that. It is something that often comes up when you do due diligence, that the site doesn't follow the occupational health and safety rules, and they miss the toilet on the site for the service technicians.
Yes.
And yeah, you can still operate without toilet. I mean, you can always find a solution for it. But during a transaction, that is a perfect opportunity to push back on the price because they're non-compliance.
Absolutely.
For me, I use that. That's my golden toilet, so, if you may. So, but it works. So.
It seems as though lenders DD as well as buyers red flag DD are not really equipped to identify these shortcomings and the misalignment in objectives. Would you agree with that as a summary point?
Yeah, I could. To some extent agree. Don't get me wrong. Most of these red flag DDs really highlight non-compliances and non-conformities. So because that's what they're looking for. They're looking at the documentation, the as-built, They go out to the site and really identify if there's anything there that needs to be highlighted as a red flag and a potential issue long term. But I think, again, if you use the cross-functional competence, but also add your own people into the due diligence, you have a bigger opportunity to identify these as well. Because I'm sure we've all seen it, that there are things that you always have to add to that. And once you have transaction, you might also have experience that you need to go in and fix things, which could have been identified at an early stage. But I do hope still that the people that we use for the legal and the financial and the technical diligence still have the degree of competence to ensure that we're not doing any major mistakes. But I'm still think there is an opportunity to focus a bit more on that as well.
So would you say that the current forms of DD are more risk-focused or performance-focused, and why?
And I think they're more performance-focused, maybe risk from a legal perspective, but I think there could be more done to try to, if you have the time, of course, to identify if there's any risk that you need to be aware of when you move into operations. So operations then, the operations team, then will be able to mitigate those and plan for those so you can avoid those from happening as well. Because an unforeseen event that could actually lead to quite long stops, which would have an impact on the financial of these products as well.
The position that I come from on this is, as you know, is very much from a safety perspective, given the type of work that I do. But in the main, it's about understanding where the risk precursors lie. And what our work majors on is looking at operational and organizational alignment, because if you have misaligned organizations and operations, you have the opportunity for risks to emerge from the system. And I remember advising a client not so long ago about a corporate acquisition in South America. The company or the buyer was really keen on trying to maximize the value from the acquisition, and one of their strategies was to reduce the long-term assets on the business's balance sheet. And for all of you out there, one of the key ways of reducing the long-term liabilities is by reducing headcount. So their approach was, let's create early retirement packages for highly paid staff within the target organization, and potentially re-employ or bring in new staff. And from our standpoint, that was a classic risk precursor in the making, because if you're removing safety critical roles from the organization, where does that leave us in terms of plant knowledge?
I couldn't agree more. This is probably one of the biggest risks I've seen, actually. What you're removing there is actually the organization who have the knowledge, the history, have gone through the process of identifying and mitigating the risk, and they have the knowledge, they know where to look for. And also they've hopefully also been able to document that. So if you remove them from the organization and put someone else in to manage that, there will be a gap. So that this transaction comes with an organization that decide to change it. But I also want to ensure that we all understand that this actually happens for every transaction that you do. So either it comes with an organization, here you capture historic value and the people and the knowledge, but that's therefore very, very important when you do an acquisition that you understand the potential risk. And that is then looking at the organization. So ensure that you bring in competences, not just from your technical engineering department. What about health and safety managers? Have they been part of the due diligence as well? Is there anything they can add to your due diligence here to identify those things?
Absolutely. So these are really critical points, because what we've begun to explore under this general umbrella heading are not only the issues arising from the current approaches to DD, but also how asset strategies affect DD, and how DD should be modified or refocused dependent upon how the buyer and the seller is coming together, in order to determine whether there's alignment between the buyer's objectives and the seller's objectives, and how those might create risks, or to identify risks that lie in that gap, and then fairly and equitably divide that risk financially or otherwise. But DD, being performance orientated, as you've just said, must focus on operation and organizational alignment, making sure that the competencies within the target organization are retained and developed. But what about the other issues, the softer issues, apart from the technical, the commercial, and the regulatory? This market depends quite a lot on the supply chain.
Absolutely. I mean, when you do a technical diligence, you look at what kind of equipment and components you have. You try to identify if there is any risk associated to the supply chain when you do that as well. But it's not just to get access to the components. You should also take a look at the organization that is managing the assets on your behalf. It could be the OEMs or the service provider that you're using for this occasion as well. What do they bring to the table? Have they captured knowledge that you can benefit from? Because then again, that will reduce the gap from the historical organization that were operating the assets into your new organization. So when you embed them, if you see that there's competence within your contractors, you can draw that to your knowledge as well. So I think that's key. But unfortunately, that's not always the focus when you do due diligence. And that could be a lack of time, because there is a transaction timeline, could be very tight. You're not allowed to do too much work in the beginning, which means that there is always a challenge to fit all of these things into your due diligence process.
No, absolutely.
And that's a risk.
It's a big risk. And one of the reasons that it is a very large risk is, having done due diligence in the past, you often take a view that in relation to the supply chain, there is a contract in place, it has X number of years to run, you are deriving some degree of security and confidence in terms of your ongoing performance from it, but you're not looking to the next level. The next level that is not being met is whether the contract is actually being fulfilled in a satisfactory way by the supply chain, and if not, why not? Because if you're then acquiring the asset and you're acquiring the contract with it, you have to fund the underperformance over a prolonged period of time.
Absolutely. So what you do look at operational figures. So that's the way you measure performance, historic performance. That doesn't mean that your service contract is performing well. It could be that your asset has been performing well. So it's not the same thing, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely.
So by trying to, if you have the time to go in and identify what are the service scope, so what are their responsibility and accountability of managing that? Are they managing the supply chain of spare part components, and how well are they equipped to do that? So those are simple things that you could check that still fits within the very tight timeline of a due diligence, I would say.
It would be so surprising if I said to you that a few cases that we looked at recently, where understanding where the contractors were performing, particularly O&M contractors were performing, was looking at the rate of completion of statutory inspections. And that's such an easy indicator to look for, yet many asset owners are still not calling for that metric on their monthly reports, which is quite surprising. But nonetheless, hope that you've enjoyed this conversation and that you have taken something away from it, or it's giving you an opportunity to reflect. In the event that you haven't seen Jimmy's other sprints relating to supply chain alignment, achieving LCOE and safe operations, or indeed the third one, Jimmy, was
M&A and operations.
M&A and operations integration, then I really urge you to watch those, because they contain several nuggets. But in the meantime, Jimmy, it's been great jamming with you.
Thank you, Rakesh. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure. Hopefully you take some value from this as well. So.
Excellent. Goodbye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.